Today's daf is Menachos daf Tzadik Gimel, and we are 3 lines from the top of daf Tzadik Gimel Amid Aleph, the 2 dots, Hayoresh Soymich. So yesterday we began a new sugya, the sugya of smicha. We gave a little bit of an introduction, talked about what exactly smicha was meant to represent, meaning in as much as Karbonos Bechlal and Avodas Befrat are all L'mayla Me'asagosenu, like the Ramban lays out in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. But at the same time, the idea of smicha was that the Bal HaKarban, by leaning his weight on the animal, was transferring whatever it was that he had of Zayin Hartz, whatever Averis he was carrying on his places, and he was literally imparting it through osmosis, or through smicha, onto the animal that he was leaning on. That's l'chura, the inyan of why the Rambam in the end of Perek Gimel Hilchas Maaseh HaKarbanos says that this that we find in Chazal, that a Bal HaKarban had to be mesvada, he had to do tshuva. The vidui component of the tshuva used to take place at the time of the smicha, because smicha is when this person is getting rid of his averis. That's when he's doing the proverbial kaparis or tashlich or whatever mashal you want to use, and it's therefore very befitting and appropriate at that point to be misvada to do tshuva. Either way, yesterday's daf discussed a lot of halachas related to smicha, mostly drashidik. Today's daf is a continuation, albeit a much lighter continuation. So the Mishnah at the very end of daf Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph said, "V'hayoresh soymich." That within the laws of smicha, if somebody yarshins a carbon from his father, his mother, and he now has an obligation, b'teiras yoresh, to bring this carbon, he too would do smicha. Why is it a chiddush? Smicha is b'bailim. So there could have been a thought that, being that the yoresh is not really the bailim, now he is, but initially he wasn't, so maybe he's excluded from the parsha of smicha. Talmud Loimer, the Mishnah said the Yerush is Soymich. And then the Mishnah said, oh, by the way, we just mentioned the Yerush, so this would seem to be a befitting and an appropriate place to tell me some other halachas about Yerush. Right? There's no Masechtas Yerush, there's no Perik Yerush, so this is really the place to talk about it. So as it relates to a Yerush, a carbon, you should know, in addition to the fact that he's Soymich, he's also Mevi Nesachim, hashtag 2 days ago's daf, Umeimar, additionally, if he went and he violated the laws of Tamura, it would be considered a Tmura. On that note, says the Gemara, Tani Rav Chananya Kamei Rav. So Rav Chananya presented a brisa in the presence of the great Rava. And the brisa said as follows, Yoresh einoi soymech. A Yoresh can't do smicha, Yoresh einoi meimar, and a Yoresh cannot do Tmura, which is the exact antithesis of what we just mentioned from the Mishnah. So the Gemara says when Rava heard what Rav Chananya said, he told him, come again, Vanan Tanan, it's a Mishnah, HaYoresh soymech, Umevi esnech sachab umeimer. But as relates to the first and the third thing, not a yoresh einoi soymech, a yoresh soymech, and not a yoresh einoi meimer. Umeimer, the yoresh is meimer. Amalei. So Rav Chananya was very taken aback, and he told him, if chay, right? He looked at Rava. Are you suggesting that this must be a mistaken brisa? Do I have to flip the girsa? Instead of the brisa saying Yerush Einoi Soymech, Yerush Einoi Meimer, should it say HaYerush Soymech Umeimer? Amalei. So Rava told him, Lo Yitzrich, it's not something that you have to do, because we can get out of the situation by saying Masnis Amani. You want to know who the Tana of the Bryce is. Usually Masnis is the Mishnah, but you want to know who the Tana of the Bryce is. Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda. Which Rabbi Yehuda? Tanya learned to the Bryce. So Yerush Soymech, Yerush Meimer. That's the halach of our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said Yerush Einoi Soymech, Yerush Einoi Meimer. Meaning there's a mafurish Bryce that presents this as a machlokes Tanan. Hence your Bryce, which contradicts our Mishnah, doesn't necessarily need to be edited, because you could always say Hamani, that other man, the Amar, who by the way has a name, it's the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. So in other words, whether or not Yeresh is Soymech and Yeresh is Meimer is really b'machloikes shnuya. It's a stam Mishnah one way, happens to be a stam B'raisa somewhere else the other way, and really at the end of the day, it's a machloikes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. So according to the Chachamim, which is the Stam Mishnah, Yoresh Soimech Yoresh Meimer. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Yoresh Einoi Soimech Yoresh Einoi Meimer. Says the Gemara, my time of the Rabbi Yehuda. What is the Makar in Shittas Rabbi Yehuda? Why does he hold that a Yoresh is Einoi Soimech and a Yoresh is Einoi Meimer? Says the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Because it says Karbanoi. Now, if you remember, at the very, very end of yesterday's daf, it's actually the top line of Daf Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph, we mentioned that it says the word Karbanoi 6 times extra in the parsha of Smicha in the context of the Shlomim. Rashi says 3 of those times we darshaned elsewhere, and the other 3 were darshaned on the very top of the Amud. If you remember, the Gemara said that the first Karbanoi is V'loi Karban Chaveroi. You can't be a shliach for smicha. The second one was Karbanoi V'loi Karban Ovik Echavim. If a guy brings a carbon, there's no smicha on his carbon. And finally, Karbanoi L'Rabbi is called Bali Karban L'Smicha. That in the event that shutfim bring a carbon, each shutif, every member of that entity needs to go ahead and provide some sort of smicha. So on that note, says Rabbi Yehuda, you want to know why I hold that a Yerush is Einoi Soimech? It's because you remember it says Karbanoi, and I hold that one of those 3 extra Karbanis are teaching me V'loi Karban Aviv, that Dafka for your carbon, not for your father's carbon. So if you're a Yoresh is Aviv, there's not going to be smicha. Says Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, that explains why a Yoresh is Einoi Soimech. What about why does Rabbi Yehuda hold that Yoresh is Einoi Meimer? V'yalav Tchilas Hektish, Misoif Hektish. Rabbi Yehuda learned Tmura, which the Gemara here refers to as Tchilas Hektish, from smicha, which we refer to as Soif Hektish. So Tchilas Hektish means somewhere in the onset of this hektish. Soif hektish means when you're ready, starting to do the avodah. So Tmura over here is Tchilas hektish, right? A more conventional Tchilas hektish would mean when a person says, I raise oila. But okay, Tmura is another way of making something hektish. So Tmura is referred to the Gemara as Tchilas Hektish. Smicha is referred to as Soif Hektish. Rashi says the reason is because Tekef Smicha Shchitas, it happened right before the Avodah started. So that's at the very, very end of its status of Hektish before you're actually delivering it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rabbi Yehuda says it makes sense to learn Tchilas Hektish from Soif Hektish. Ama Soif Hektish, Yerush Ein Soimech, just like as it relates to Soif Hektish, as it relates to Smicha, the Yerush is excluded. After Tchilas Hektish, so too as it relates to the Tchilas Hektish, which is the Tmura, Yerush Ein Meimer, he's going to be excluded as well. So my time with the Rabbi Yehuda, Karbanoi V'loi Karban Aviv, that's Memayat the Yoresh from Smicha, and if he's Nesmayit from Smicha, he's Nesmayit from Tmura. What Shaykhis, what does Smicha have to do with Tmura? Believe it or not, they're the 2 bookends of the Hektish. One is Tchilas Hektish, one is the Soif Hektish, and it makes sense that whatever's by one is going to be by the other. Rabbanon says, the Gemara, what do Rabbanon hold? Rabbanon hold Yoresh is Soimech, and he's Meimer. Rabbanon hold, it says in the parsha of Tmura, Homer Yomer. V'im Homer Yomer. That's a double lashon. It's coming to be married, but something. Rabbi says a Yerush, that a Yerush is included in Tmura. Okay, and once I know that a Yerush is included in Tmura, the aforementioned methodology, we're now going to learn Smicha, which is Soif Hektish, from Tmura, which is Tchilas Hektish. Ma Tchilas Hektish Yerush Meimer. Just like as it relates to Tchilas Hektish, the Yerush is Meimer. Af Soif Hektish, so too as it relates to Soif Hektish, Smicha, Yerush Soimech, he's going to be Soimech. In other words, the Machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is had a darshan psukim. That's obvious. Rabbi Yehuda holds that Yoresh is Einoi Soimech because Karbanoi V'loi HaYoresh, and once I know that a Yoresh is excluded from Smicha, Memela, I'm also going to know that a Yoresh is excluded from Tmura. What Shaykh is, one is Soif Hektish, the other is Tchilas Hektish. It makes sense to learn one from the other. The Rabbanon Darshan Vim Homer Yomer as relates to Tmura L'Rabbeis Yoresh. Oh, if I know a Yerush is included in Tchilas Hektish, I know he has to be included in Soif Hektish as well. Same methodology. I'm Yolef Soif Hektish with Tchilas Hektish. So Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan agree to a certain extent, and that is in terms of the concept, the principle of learning Tchilas Hektish from Soif Hektish or vice versa. The idea that those 2 should be the same. The question is, what's the starting point? According to Rabbi Yehuda, the starting point is Karbanoi V'loi HaYoresh, and then we work backwards from there. According to the Rabbanan, it's Vim Homer Yomer L'Rabbeis es HaYoresh, and we move forward from there. Now, what's going to be the next part of the avodah of the daf? It's going to be to try to understand why Rabbi Yehuda darshans Karbanoi and the Rabbanon don't darshan Karbanoi. Why the Rabbanon would darshan V'Homer Yomer and the Rabbi Yehuda would not darshan Hamer Yamer, or b'milam acherim. What do the Rabbanon do with karbanoi, and what does Rabbi Yehuda do with Vim Hamer Yamer? Oh, and by the way, if that's what the Rabbanon do with karbanoi, then what's Rabbi Yehuda going to say? And if that's what Rabbi Yehuda does with Vim Hamer Yamer, what are the Rabbanon going to say? So there's going to be a little bit of a valley from here now until the Mishnah, just going through this Shakla V'Tarya, classic Gemara. Says the Gemara, Vaytav Rabbanon, Hay Karbanoi May Avdile. What did the Rabbanon do with karbanoi of Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda darshan karbanoi v'loy ayoresh, right? V'loy karban aviv. What did the Rabbanon do with that? So the Gemara says, oh, that's easy. That was the end of yesterday's daf. They learned from the word karbanoi, karbanoi v'loy karban oivekei chavim, karbanoi v'loy karban chaveri, karbanoi the rabbis called bali karban l'smicha. All three of them were already taken, so there's nothing extra. Says the Gemara, okay, for Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, what's Rabbi Yehuda going to do? So the Gemara has two suggestions. Either the rabbis call bali karban l'smicha less. So either Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of one of those three, because he holds that if there are many shutfin in a carbon, then they could appoint one of the shutfin to go ahead and do the smicha. It's not considered a shlichus, and in that instance, it's going to work for everybody else. So he doesn't have that one application of karbanai, hence there's one extra to be memayet. Alternatively, another way to learn is that Avad Rabbi Yehuda holds that karbanoi, one of them is the rabbis called bali karban l'smicha. However, Islay, meaning he holds that that's really included, but at the same time, he holds that karbanoi v'loy oivekei chavim and karbanoi v'loy karban chaveri doesn't need two karbanos because really they're one and the same. Think about it. What does karban v'lei karban chaveri mean? That the bala karban has to be the one to do the smicha. Okay, so if Reuven can't have Shimon do the smicha for him, well then in a Yehudi, a guy also can't have a Yid do smicha for him because it's like gara. At the end of the day, the guy is the bailam, not the Yid, and it's for that reason that Rabbi Yehuda holds that those two halachis are learned from one karbanai. Well, if that's the case, ayatrule treikrai, then there are going to be two karbanis that are going to be left over. Chad karban like karban aviv, the idach l'rabbi is called bali karban lismicha. But the bottom line is, the Gemara says, you want to know why the Rabbanon don't darshan karbani the way Rabbi Yehuda did, is because according to the Rabbanon, it's taken. By the way, 6 karbanos, and they're all taken. If there was a 7th, gesundheit, but we don't have a 7th, or we have a 6th. Okay, what does Rabbi Yehuda do? So the Gemara has 2 8s, is why according to Rabbi Yehuda, maybe it's not going to be taken. Good. Now we have to work the other way. Rabbi Yehuda, hay hamer yamer my oven. Like, the Rabbanan starting point was hamer yamer, as it relates to Tmura, was l'rabis as ha-yoirish. And from there, he went forward and he said that the yoirish is going to be included in smicha. Obviously, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't learn hamer yamer is l'rabis as ha-yoirish because he holds the yoirish as a name. So, the Gemara, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with Hamer Yamer? The Rabbi says, so Isha. He uses it to teach me that an Isha is included in the parasha of Tmura. Why would I think not? The Tanya, it's a brayso. Because if you go through the parasha of Tmura, the entire parasha is talking Balashon Zachar. And based on that alone, you would have thought that an Isha would be excluded. There's Masoi Feinu, the Rabbi says Isha. At the end of the day, Masoi Feinu, is there any Eitzah here to be Marbes or Isha? Talmud Omer, yeah. It says Homer Yomer. Homer Yomer is L'Rabbis Es Isha. It's a Mefurish, a Braisa that Chazal already used Homer Yomer, the Rabbi says Isha. And that is the way Rabbi Yehuda is going to learn. It says the Gemara V'Rabbanon. What about the Rabbanon? How do they know the Rabbi says Isha? If Homer Yomer is the Rabbi says Yorish, how do you know to be Marba Isha? Tarshi mi ve'im. It says not just Homer Yomer, ve'im Homer Yomer. Now, it had to say im Homer or im Yomer, or if you want to be married with the Yorish, im Homer Yomer. So what's the drush? It's the vav. It's ve'im. The Rabbanan darshan the vav, Rabbanan ve'im loit arish. Yehuda doesn't darshan the vav, and being that he doesn't darshan the vav, so it's for that reason he only has one drasha. The Rabbi says Isha, he doesn't have a drasha also to be l'Rabbis es hayirish. So again, as it relates to why the Rabbanan don't darshan the karbani of Rabbi Yehuda, which was the even apina of Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, it's because all 6 karbanos are already taken. There's no karbanoi to be memayit or yairish. As it relates to why Rabbi Yehuda doesn't darshan the v'mhamer yamer like the Rabbanon do, which was the Anachas Even Apina of Shitas HaRabbanon, it's because whereas the Rabbanon darshan hamer yamer is l'Rabbis es hayairish, Rabbi Yehuda kedetanya darshan hamer yamer is l'Rabbis es ha-isha. Moving along, another Mishnah. Hakol soimchen. Everybody that brings a carbon does smicha. But You have to read the not such fine print. Chutz micheres shoyte v'katan v'suma v'vikachamim v'eved v'ashliach v'ha'isha. Whoa, that's a long list. So everyone does smicha? Not really. A cheresh doesn't do smicha. A shoyte doesn't do smicha. A katan doesn't do smicha. A suma doesn't do smicha. An evikachamim doesn't do smicha. An eved, as in an eved knani, doesn't do smicha. A shliach can't do smicha on behalf of somebody else, and a woman or an isha doesn't do smicha either. Usmicha shiari mitzvah. Sagt the Mishnah, smicha is shiari mitzvah, meaning it's extra credit. It's not ma'akiv the carbon. It's interesting. We know that whatever comes after the zrika is shiarei mitzvah. Smicha comes before the zrika. So there could have been a havamina that maybe this is actually ma'akiv. Kamash malon smicha is shiarei mitzvah, it's not ma'akiv. Additionally, al harosh, smicha had to be done on the head of the animal. Bebeis yadayin, with by the hand, it had to be done with two hands. Ubemakim shesoimchin sheichten, the smicha was done wherever the shchita was going to be done. So wherever the shchita was going to be done, kachik kadashim shchitasim betzafain, kachim kalim, bechol makim, wherever the shchita was going to be done, whatever was identified at the place, that's exactly what you have to do the smicha. Additionally, v'teikav l'smicha shchita. There couldn't be any time lapse between the smicha and the shchita. So this is like, there's a halach of kiddush b'makom suda, right? Which means you're supposed to make kiddush where you're going to eat and also when you're going to eat. There's a similar idea of take of the smicha shchita, which defines makom and it defines zman. So number one, b'makom shesoimchin sheichten. Number two, v'teikav zman-wise, the smicha had to be the shchita. So the Gemara now is going to do what it does. It's going to analyze the Mishnah, taking it from the top. Hakol soimchin chutz mecheres shoyte v'katan v'suma. That's the first analysis of the Gemara. The Gemara says as follows: Bishlei mecheres shoyte v'katan. I understand why a cheresh shoyte v'katan are excluded from the mitzvah of smicha, and the reason is the lav b'nei deyaninu. It's because they don't have das, and being that they don't have das, they can't be included in smicha. Now this is a little bit interesting. What does das have to do with smicha? In order to do smicha, you have to have das. In order to do smicha, you have to be able to lean b'chol koichai. Bebeis yadayim al harosh, right? B'makim shesoimchin and teikav l'smicha. Shchita, that's all you have to do. It's a physical act. Where does Lav B'nei Deya impact that? If you look at the Rishonim say it's because they don't have kavanah to be able to do the smicha. Does this mean because the Indian of smicha is the vidoy and it's the tshuva? But al kapadim, the Gemara says that because the cheresh shait v'katan throughout Shas are not B'nei Deya, so it's for that reason they can't do smicha either. Oivik Chavim Nami, when the Mishnah says that an Oivik Chavim is excluded, that's also pashit. It's because it says in the parasha of smicha, Daber el B'nei Yisrael, and we learn from the B'nei Yisrael Soimchem Oivik Chavim Soimchem. So that's easy. Why cheresh shait v'katan are excluded? Easy. Why Oivik Chavim is excluded? Easy. El Suma my time alone. Why can't a Suma do smicha? A Suma is a bardas. So if that's the case, he's a regular yid. Why should he be excluded from the mitzvah of smicha? So the Gemara says it was a machlokes amayra. Rav Chizda v'Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi. But who said what? We don't know. Chad Amar once said, that the makar, that a suma is excluded from smicha, is learned out from Gzeirus Shava. Smicha from the Ziknei Ha'eda. So what's the smicha of the Ziknei Ha'eda? See yesterday's daf. But we know the Ziknei Ha'eda did smicha on the Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor. Okay, in order to be a member of the Ziknei Ha'eda, that person could not be a suma. And being that a suma is excluded then from doing the smicha on the Paral Davar Shel Tzibor, why? Because who did the smicha on the Paral Davar Shel Tzibor? The Ziknei Ha'eda, the Sanhedrin, and a member of the Sanhedrin was not allowed to be a suma. Well, if that's the case, so too we learn from here that all smicha is going to have the same halacha that a suma is going to be excluded. The other one said, Asya smicha mi oilas re'iyah. We learned smicha from the oilas re'iyah, that the oilas re'iyah requires smicha. How do you know the oilas re'iyah requires smicha? So the Gemara is going to bring a drasha for that. But the oilas re'iyah required smicha, and the mitzvah of re'iyah is also something that excludes a suma. That means a suma is never going to have a mitzvah to do smicha on an oilas re'iyah because he's parted from the mitzvah of re'iyah, and as a result, he's parted from the oilas re'iyah. So, being that a suma is excluded from that smicha, so too, he's going to be excluded from all smichas. The bottom line is, it was machlokes Rav Yitzchak by Rav Dimi and Rav Chizda, it was a chadam. One said that a summa is potter from smicha. We learned it from the smicha of the param davar shal tzibur because the ziknei eida weren't sumin. The other one said it's learned out from the smicha of the oilas riyah because someone that's a summa obviously is potter from the oilas riyah. Says the Gemara, the man, I'm a oilas riyah. My time like, oh, the ziknei eida, the man, I've learned it from the oilas riyah. It sounds like he held you learn it from the oilas riyah and it's a oska action. You don't learn it out from the ziknei eida. Why not? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Done in yachid miyachid, vein done in yachid mitzibur. Because when we say that a summa is potter from smicha, we mean a summa that brings a carbon yachid, right? Obviously, that's what we're talking about. So a summa brings a carbon yachid, he's potter from smicha. You're going to learn it from parallel davashal tzibur, which is a carbon tzibur, done in yachid miyachid, ain't done in yachid mitzibur. Man, the yalef mi ziknei eda, my time la yalef mi oilas riyah. The man that learned it from ziknei eda, and he was willing to stretch himself to learn yachid mitzibur. Wouldn't it make more sense to learn from the oilas riyah, which is yachid mi yachid? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why he didn't want to do that, because done in midi dechsiv beismicha begufe mi mida dechsiv beismicha begufe. He wanted to learn a smicha where the Torah says mefurish the smicha from something where the Torah mefurish discusses its din smicha, lafuke oilas re'iyah, as opposed to the oilas re'iyah, the he gufa me oilas nadava gam, where it doesn't say anywhere mefurish in the Torah that smicha was done on the oilas re'iyah. It's learned out from your classic oilas nadava. What is that? Drasha, the Tani Tana committed Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. There was a Tana that once presented the following drasha in the presence of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. It says in the pasuk, "Vayakrev es ha'oila, vayaseha kamishpat," and this is in Parsha Shmini, and this is talking about the karbonis of the miluim. But it says "Vayakrev es ha'oila, vayaseha kamishpat," and what's the mishpat? Kemishpat oilas nadava. It's referring to the mishpat of the oilas nadava, and we learn from here limid al oilas chayve shetunu smicha. And this is a makar that Aaron HaKohen's oilas chayve that he brought by Yom Hashmini. And all oilas chayva, such as the oilas riyah, also requires smicha. But here's the point: it doesn't say anywhere mefurish that the oilas riyah required smicha. It's something that's learned out from the word kamishpat, being that it's not mefurish. You'd rather learn from something mefurish than learn from not something mefurish. The bottom line is, the Mishnah said hakol soimchin, and then gave us a whole list of exclusions. Chutz micheres shoyte v'katan. So far, we tackled the first five. Who come together, they're all excluded from smicha because they're la b'nei deya. And somehow the fact that not b'nei das impacts their ability, or lack thereof, to do smicha. We mentioned the summa. The summa is excluded. It's machloikis, Rav Chizda, and Rav Yitzchak bar Adimi. Chad Amar. One learned it from the Ziknei Eda. The smicha of the Ziknei Eda couldn't be done by Suman because the Sanhedrin couldn't be Suman. So to all smicha can't be done by a Suma. The other learned out from the smicha of the Eilas Riyah. The Eilas Riyah required smicha, and someone that was a Suma was pater from Riyah. Hence, every summa is always going to be pater from smicha. What about oivdei kechavim? That the Gemara held was easy. Bnei Yisrael soimchen, ve'ein oivdei kechavim soimchen. So now we're going to go through the rest of the list, and that is v'ha'eved, v'ha'shliach, v'ha'ish. As the Gemara Tanu Rabbanon, it says in the parsha of smicha the word yadai. In fact, we're going to darshan now 3 mentions of the word yadai with regards to smicha, and we learn from there yadai v'lo yad avdai. You, the bailim, have to do the smicha. Your evet Kanani can't do it on your behalf. You, the bailim, have to do the smicha. You can't have a shliach do it on your behalf. And you, the bailim, have to do the smicha. You can't have your wife do it on your behalf. Says the Gemara, Kol hani lamali. Why do I need 3? Meaning, it should just say yadai, which it says, and from there I would know it has to be yadai. Meaning, if it has to be yadai, that one mention of Yadai l'chayra excludes all 3 of these categories. I need a special Yadai to be Memayid Avdai, and then another one for Shluchai, and then another one for Ishtay. The Gemara says, Yatzricha Aito. And the reason is because Avdai, Shluchai, and Ishtay were not all created equally. They're different as it relates to this sugya. Each one has its own nuance, its own yichus, its own chashivas, and therefore, if all I had was yadei, which is a miyad, I would think not necessarily to be memaydo. If they're all the same, I would be memaydo. But if they're not the same, then there's already mokum to say I'll be memayid this, not that, not the other. Again, this is Talmud Bavli 101. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what, because Rachman Echad had it only said one yadei, have a min, I would have told them what they eved. who is the lowest hanging fruit in terms of being memayit over here? I would think it's the Eved. And the reason is the lav bar mitzvahs, because an Eved is not a bar mitzvahs. And really the punchline is in the next line of Gemara. Being that he's not a bar mitzvah, so he's excluded from the parsha of shlichos. Ma'atem b'nei bris, av shluchachem b'nei bris. An Eved Kanani can never be your shliach. He can't be your shliach to be mekadosh anisha. He can't be your shliach to do mekach hamemker. So being that he's someone that's always excluded from being a hemshech of you, so I would have thought Yada is coming to be made him. Avo shliach, but a shliach the bar mitzvah. And because he's a bar mitzvah, v'shlucha shel adam k'moisa is included in the parish of shlichus of the second parak of Masechtas Kedushin of really kala teir kula. So ema lismaich, I would think he's included. Yashmin hani tarti, had I only known two, so I would know to be ma'ayit evet, I would know to be ma'ayit shliach. But maybe even them, the lav kegufei damya, even a shliach who's a bar mitzvah who has power of attorney, but he's not mamish you. Aval ishtoi the kegufa damya, but ishtoi who we know is ishtoi kegufa. Maybe she should be able to do smicha for you. Tzricha. That's why I would need three. But the bottom line is because Eved, Shlich, and Isha are not all one and the same, therefore we need three miyutim. This Gemara is an interesting Gemara. We spoke about this 7.5 years ago, where you see that the idea of Ishta Kegufay, which is usually more of a Musar Digga theme. This is more in Yonim that you hear in Sheva Brachas Torah. You see it permeates halacha that there would have been a Havamina that the Hilcha Shlichus of Ishtoi would have been different. Ishta Kegufay is not just Musar. Ishta Kegufa is a real Metzias, and you could have thought that a Shliach not, but an Ishta yeah. Moving along. The Mishnah then said, the smicha shiarei mitzvah. That as it relates to smicha, you should know it's not ma'akiv kapara, it's extra credit, it's shiarei mitzvah. So the Gemara is going to bring a price in that that's going to elaborate on this point. Tanu Rabbanan. It says, v'samach v'nirtza. Where does it say that? So this is Parshas Vayikra Perek Al Pasuk Dal. This was the pasuk that we began the sugya with. V'samach yadai al rosh ha'oila v'nirtza loy lechaper olav. That mysteriously the Torah mentions the inyan of ritzoy and kapara that one gets when he brings a carbon. Take a smicha, right? That's what we mention it. Smicha, and then immediately we mention this inyan of ritzoy. But the Gemara asks, v'chi smicha mechaperes v'lo yen kapara ela b'dam. Right? It can't be literally. It can't be v'samach v'nirtza. You have to do zrika. You have to do that by the time. You didn't do anything. You didn't do shchita yet. Shenemar ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper. And how do you know in kapara ela b'dam? It's a pasuk in the Torah that kapara always goes to them. What's this pasuk coming to tell me? As far as the smicha shiarei mitzvah, that in the event a person treats the smicha as shiarei mitzvah, it doesn't mean he treats it as shiarei mitzvah. So it sounds like a hergish type of thing. But if you look at Rashi says it means you don't do it, right? If you don't do the smicha because I don't have to do it, so maybe you don't do it. Mala all of our costs of kilu loy keeper. We act as if the person didn't get kapara. However, the keeper, he really does get kapara. Rashi says what this means in English is that what the Torah is saying is that as much as smicha is not ma'akiv, ki adamhu benefesh yichaper, that's what the kapara is all about. But at the same time, there's a mitzvah min mufcher. There's a level of kapara that a person only gets if he goes ahead and he does the smicha. So that, is it mechaper? No, but it's ke'ilu mechaper. Or if you don't do the smicha, it's ke'ilu loy keeper. And that's what we learn from the smichos of the smicha and the kapara. Says the Gemara, V'tanya gabi tenufa ki agamna. We have a similar brisa that discussed tenufa that seems to mirror what we just said with regards to smicha. What's the background of that brisa? So the pasuk says, L'tenufa l'chaper. Ve'imdalhu ve'in yodei maseges ve'lokach keves echad osham l'tenufa l'chaper. Talking about the Karbanos of the Mitzayra. This week's parsha says the Brais of Tenufa Mechaperes was the Tenufa Mechaper, the Tenufa Lechaper, Falein Kapar El Badam, Shenamikadamu Benefesh Yichaper, El the same shtickle time, Shemasal the Tenufa Shari Mitzvah. In the event that the person treats the Tenufa as Shari Mitzvah, meaning he doesn't do it, Mal Olav Akasav Kilu Loy Keeper, we treat it Ki'ilu Loy Keeper, however they keep. You should know that really you do get Kapar. The bottom line is Smicha and Tenufa are both mitzvahs that are not Ma'akiv, but there's a mitzvah min Mufcher to do it, and that mitzvah namufcher translates into a kapara min amufcher. So that in the event that a person doesn't do it, there's like a ki'ilu loy keeper, right? But it's ki'ilu, magic word, loy keeper. Bottom line is, the Mishnah said that smicha is shiarei mitzvah. Now we have a little bit of a better idea of what this means. Al harosh. Next words of the Mishnah are that the smicha has to be done on the head of the animal. We have a brisa for this too. Tanu Rabbanan. It says Yadai al harosh v'samach yadai al roish karbonai. This is Vayikra Gimel Beis. This is talking about the carbon shlam, where the Torah talks about the smicha. We dashed a lot of those psukim in the last 2 days. It says yadai al harosh, and we learn from there v'lo yadai al atzavar, and we learn that the yad, it has to be dafka al harosh, but it can't be al hatzavar. Yadai, it says yadai a second time. We learn from there yadai al harosh v'lo yadai al gabayim, that it has to be dafka on the head as opposed to on the gabayim. If the smicha was done on the back of the animal, it's not going to be okay. Yadai, it says it a third time. We learn from there yadai al harosh v'lo yadai al chazeh. If it's going to be on the chazeh, the breast of the animal, that's also not going to be okay. It says in Kalani, Lamali, why do I need all these drushes? I need 3 drushes, yadai. To do that, l'chura, if it's, or yadei al rosh, right? We were focusing on yadei in the previous drushes. This is yadei al rosh. Why do I need it 3 times? If it says yadei al rosh, I know it's not on the throat. I know it's not on the gabayim. It's not on the chazeh. So why do I need it to say yadei al rosh draimul? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why it's tzrichti. I only said it one time. I would have thought I would have thought it's coming to me with the throat, and the reason is the like koi bahadei roshai, because the throat is not parallel to the head, right? So an animal, when it's standing on all 4s, so the head is obviously the top of the animal and the throat is hanging down. So being that it's not shava b'shava to the rosh, so you would have thought that's why it's not okay. Meaning, al rosh has to be maybe not mamish on the rosh, it just can't be on the tzavar. Abul gaboy, as it relates to the back, the koi lahadi rosh, which is shava b'shava to the rosh. Maybe that's not excluded from rosh. Tzricha, I need a second. I would have thought that the reason smicha doesn't work on the tzavar and the gabayim because you don't find a mitzvah of tenufa. Where tenufa is applicable, like right here, the shlamim, you don't find tenufa by that part of the animal. Avul chazah, this rabbi tenufa, but the chazah v'shaik were included in the mitzvah of tenufa. I would have thought it's not excluded. Meaning, once you find that the Torah said you do the mitzvah of tenufa with the chazah, so maybe the mitzvah of smicha should also be done with the chazah. Tzricha, that's why I needed 3 miyutim. Yadai alat stadim. What would be if the person did smicha on the head, but he did it on the sides of the head, not mamish on top of the head? What would be the halacha? Like holding on to the cheeks, Rashi says, on the licha yayim. Tashma, Tanya, Abba Bira, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Abba Bira, Rashi says, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, said, Yadai al rosh. Right, this is the same Yadai al harosh that we mentioned earlier, and we learn from here, Yadai al roshai, v'lo Yadai al atzadim. It has to be on the top of the head. However, if it's going to be on the side, even on the cheeks, that already is not going to be, okay. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah. Matlis ma'u shetachotz. If somebody does smicha, but he puts a shmata in between his hands and the animal, maybe he's a little squeamish, whatever, but he takes a matlis and he puts it, but you can hear, right, between him and the animal itself. Is that a problem? Is there an issue with a chatzitza? So the Gemara says tashmat, right? Usually Rabbi Yirmiyah's shailas, everybody started like squirming, and nobody was really sure what to do. I mean, ad k'dei kach, they had to ask him Filibis Medrash at one point, but the Gemara says it's a mefurish brayso. This is from the easier shailas. It seems Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, it's a mefurish brayso. Can't have a chatzitza. That's the end of that conversation. Back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that smicha has to be done with beide hand. It has to be done with 2 hands. Says the Gemara, how do you know that you have to do smicha with 2 hands? And by the way, what's the background to the minani mili? Sometimes minani mili is, I don't know, it's just like an unintelligent type of minani mili. But this minani mili is a very rich minani mili. Every time the Torah talks about smicha, it says v'samach yadai, v'samach es yadai, v'samach es yadai, v'samach yadai. Right? How many times does it say yadai? A bunch of times. So, and yadai always means l'chayra 1 hand. So it sounds like that it was always done with 1 hand, not with 2 hands. So the question is, minani mili, what's the makar to the halach of the Mishnah? No, smicha really has to be done with 2 hands. Amar Rish Lakish said the Amakra. The pasuk says v'samach aharon es shtei yadav. Now, this pasuk is talking about the smicha on the sar hamishtalech. V'samach aharon es shtei yadav al rosh hasar hachai. A pasuk that we spent a lot of time on yesterday's daf. Now, the Gemara says that Rish Lakish said ksiv yadai uksiv shtei. The ksiv of the word is yadai, and it also says 2. Now, we just read the word. V'samach aharon eshtei yadav. So what does it mean, ksiv yadai? Teretz is, there's yeshem lemikra and there's yeshem lemesayres. The yeshem lemikra, the way you pronounce the word is yadav. But if you look inside, it says yud dalid vav, not yud dalid yud vav. Hence, the yeshem lemesayres is yadai. And being that we darshan, sometimes the yeshem lemesayres, so we could darshan it as if it says, v'samach aharon eshtei yadai. Now, yadai is a lashon yachid, and shtei obviously means two. So grammatically, it seems to be, shtei yadav would make sense, but his two hand. It's his two hands. Zebana of said Reish Lakish, this is a binyanav. And it teaches me the following rule. Wherever it says yadai, it means two. Unless the Torah tells me otherwise. So yadai, although you would think, grammatically speaking, just based on klali diktuk, should mean one, but from here you see not that way, because shtei yadai doesn't make sense if yadai means one. Teretz says yadai means two, and therefore shtei yadai is the equivalent to shtei yadav. But the bottom line is, wherever it says yadai, it really always means two. So it's true, it says v'samach yadai, v'samach es yadai, v'samach es yadai, v'samach yadai. You have all these different mentions of yadai, but yadai means two, and that's not makar to the halacha of the Mishnah, that smicha always has to be b'shtei yadayim. So the Gemara says, who said this Reish Lakish? There's a postscript to this drasha. Also, Rabbi Lazar. Amr lahashmaita b'vei midrasha. Rabbi Lazar went into this medrash. He said over this halach, Amr b'shmei Reish Lakish, and he didn't quote Reish Lakish. He didn't say it in his name. Shama Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish got wind of the fact that Rabbi Lazar said over his drasha, not in his name, the ikbid the erik peda. He got very angry. He was very upset. And the way he expressed his anger was he walked over to Rabbi Lazar and he asked Rabbi Lazar kasha. Ki'ilu, Rabbi Lazar, you're so confident with this drasha, as if it's your drasha, right? Shlokish had thought it through a little bit, but in his mind, Rabbi Lazar heard it from him, didn't quote him, and hadn't thought it through. So he went and he asked him the following question. He said, if you're right, that wherever it says yadi, it really means tnu, lamali lemichtav yadav, Yadav. How come sometimes you find the Torah says Yadav? In fact, actually, Esrim Vidalid Yadav. He asked him 24 kashas. He found 24 times that it says the word Yadav. Yadav Tiviena, Yadav Ravloi, Sikeles Yadav. He asked him a bunch of kashas. And the Gemara says, Ishtik. Rabbi Lazar was quiet. Rabbi Lazar didn't know what to answer, right? So you say over someone else, a shtickle Torah, you better make sure you think it through the way he thought it through. Otherwise, right, you might get yourself into a little bit of trouble. And ostensibly, that seems to be what happened with the great Rabbi Lazar. The Gemara says the Nachdaite, after Reish Lakish had, in English, I guess he had calmed down a little bit. He was Nachdaite, he was okay with what had happened. He wasn't ikbid anymore. Amalei say he told him, he went to Rabbi Lazar. He says, Rabbi Lazar, I shaft you out a little bit. But come on, I had thought this through. You're a Baal Kishrin. How come you didn't come back to me? You should have told me, Yodav the Smicha Ka'amri. Right, what you should have told me was that there's a chilik between smicha and other mentions of yad. In other words, when it says yadoi in the context of smicha, there it always means two. But yadav tiviena, yadav ravloi, sikelas yadav, avada, it's not a din in yad, it's a din in yad and smicha. Right? So you said, l'chari, you could have came back and you could have told this to me. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar told him, I'll tell you why. Because besmicha namiksiv. Because I knew that by smicha you also find vayismoich es yadav olav. Now, what does it say? That's talking about when Moshe Rabbeinu gave Yeshua ben Nun smicha, which we mentioned yesterday, mirrored this inyan of smicha, where he literally did smicha b'chol koichai. So he said, I see even in the context of smicha we use the word yadav. Right? You see it very mefurish. Vayitzaveu. And when he commanded him, he told him what to do. So Reish Lakish told him again. Rabbi Lazar, he didn't think it through properly because smicha de behema ka'amri. When I said it, right, you're quoting me, right? When I said it, I meant it only by smicha de behema. So Lamaisa, I know that I made my point that in the future, please say over Torah in my name. When you heard it from me, Abba Lamaisa, there was an eitzah. And even though I came and I fired away with all these kashas, but there was a way to get out of the situation. Either way, we're going to stop here. The reason we're going to stop here is because that's where 7.5 years ago Shir picks up, even though it would make sense to learn one more line. But we're going to stop here and just speak out a few hours. So just Al Rishon, or actually Al Achroin, Rishon. So this last Gemara that we just learned, I think two very, very obvious sushtels to it. One very obvious sushtel is there's a Gemara Masechtes Yavamis Daf Tzadik Vav Amud Beis. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan had once said over a memra, very, very big chiddush. And the Gemara says, "Also Rabbi Lazar Amal Shmaita Be Midrasha." Rabbi Lazar went into Beis Medrash. He said over this halacha, "V'lei Amra Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan," and he didn't say it over in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara says, "Shama Rabbi Yochanan." Rabbi Yochanan heard what happened, ikpid, and he got angry. And there's a very long hemshech of the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Oy legabe Rabbi Ami v'Rav Asi." Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi came, and they went and they spoke to him, and they tried being Menachim Rabbi Yochanan, and Hadar ikpid fei. It backfired. What they tried using to somehow comfort Rabbi Yochanan actually worked in the reverse. And the Gemara says, finally, all the Gabei Rabbi Yaakov Aridi. Rabbi Yaakov Aridi was one of the Talmidim Rabbi Yochanan. He walked into Rabbi Yochanan. Amalei, and he told him, it says, Kashatziva Hashem es Moshe Avdoi, Kein Tziva Moshe es Yeshua, V'chein Asa Yeshua, Lehesed David Mikol Hashatziva Hashem es Moshe. From the pasuk, it seems that Yeshua ben Nun always said over in the name of Moshe. So Rabbi Yaakov Aridi tells Rabbi Yochanan, V'chi al kol dava shami Yeshua ya'imr lehem kach amali Moshe. Do you really think that every single time Yeshua ever said something out of his mouth, he would say, Kacham Ali Moshe, Kacham Moshe, Kacham Moshe? There's no way. Ela, Yeshua Yoshev V'deiristam. Yeshua ben Nun used to darshan, V'hakol yoidim she'teiraseh shal Moshe. Everyone understood that whatever Yeshua ben Nun says, he's saying over the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is Pan of Kipnei Chama. Yeshua ben Nun is Pan of Kipnei Alavana. The Lavana takes the light of the sun and it imparts it upon the world, and that's exactly what Yeshua ben Nun was doing. So Rabbi Yaakov Aridi turned to Rabbi Yochanan and he said, Af Rabbi Lazar Talmidcha, so too your Talmid Rabbi Lazar, he sits and he darshans without saying anything. V'hakol yodim, everybody knows ki shalchay, that really all the Torah that he's saying over is your Torah. Amal Hems Rabbi Yochanan heard what Rabbi Yaakov Aridi said, so he turned to them, Rav Ami and Rav Asi, who tried comforting Rabbi Yochanan in vain. And he told him, he says, how come you don't know how to be Maphayas me the way Ben Idi, our friend, knows how to be Maphayas us? Rabbi Yaakov Aridi did such a good job being Menachemi. You have to learn from him. You see, this is the way you give a person chizik. This is the way you comfort a person. But the bottom line is, this is a Gemara that mamish mirrors our Gemara, where Rabbi Yochanan had said a memra, not Rish Lakish, it was Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Lazar one, he said it stam, and Rabbi Yaakov Aridi went, and he had to be Menachem Rabbi Yochanan. Over here, it seems like Rabbi Lazar is a repeat offender. This time, he's not saying over something that he heard from Rabbi Yochanan and plagiarizing it, not saying it over in his name, but now he's saying something that he heard from Rish Lakish, and he's not saying it over in his name. But just the mirror between these two Gemaras, Azal Rabbi Lazar, Amal Shmaita Be Midrash, V'lei Amra Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan, that you see the same Gemara. Not just that, you see Rish Lakish is a Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Yochanan. Can you do it? Rabbi Yochanan was Ikpid, Rish Lakish was also Ikpid. It's interesting, I saw Rabbi Margolis in his Nitzutz Yar. On this Gemara, he says, what's Takab Shana Rabbi Lazar? And he says, Hagabatzmacha, in a Yuvamis Sadik Vavam Beis, they had a defend Rabbi Lazar. And Rabbi Yaakov Aridi was very successful in doing it. But over here, nobody comes to the defense of Rabbi Lazar. Meaning, it sounds like Rabbi Lazar needs to be defended. You can't just say, yeah, Rabbi Lazar had this Indian. He would say over sometimes Torah as if he didn't hear it from somebody else when really he heard it from somebody else. So what's the yishuv to this Gemara? So Rabbi Margolis says, I'm going to tell you what the yishuv is. He says, Rish Lakish said this halacha, right? Amar Rish Lakish to Amma Krav Samach Harin Shtei Yadav, or Yadai, Ksiv Yadai, Ksiv Shtei Zebon of Komakim Shenema Yadai Harei Kan Shnayim. Says Rabbi Margolis, I found this drasha in the Teres Kayanim. And in the Teres Kayanim, you know who says this drasha? The Tanoim. Obviously, it's Bryces are the ones that said this drasha. You know what that means? You know who was plagiarizing the drasha here? We're using that word loosely. But you know who's saying over a halacha and not giving proper credit for it? It's really Rish Lakish. It's a Mefurish at Teres Kayanim. Said Rabbi Margolis, but it can't be. Because just like Rabbi Lazar can't be doing this, Rish Lakish also can't be doing this. So he says, must be, Rish Lakish really said it over in the name of the Bryce. He said it over in the name of the Tana. Because otherwise, Rish Lakish is guilty of what he's upset at Rabbi Lazar for being guilty of. So then what was Reish Lakish having Tainas and Rabbi Elazar for? So he says, the pshat is as follows. Take a look at what I wrote in my Hakdama to Sefer Shem Olam. That's where Ruv Margolis figured out who the Chad Amars are throughout Shas. He said, in my Sefer Chad Amar over there, in the Shem Olam, I have a whole arichos that in the world of saying over Torah in somebody else's name, in the world of Kol Omer Dvar Shmo Mipiv, Maybe Gula La'olam, Sifsois of Dovais Bekever, if not you're a Gazlan, it's true even if the person is not the Mechadash of the Vart. So meaning, if you heard something from someone who heard it from someone else, in the world of properly saying it over, it's not enough you go to the source. You're supposed to say, I heard it from him who heard it from him. So why was Reish Lakish upset? He says Reish Lakish was upset because why did Rabbi Elazar say, I heard from Reish Lakish who heard from the Teretz Kayanim? Why are you cutting out the middleman? You're not supposed to cut the middleman out. And that's for sure why he was upset. He says, so what's Takab Pshan and Rabbi Elazar? So he says, I think Pshan and Rabbi Elazar is Pasha. Being that we just established that it wasn't really Rish Lakish's Chiddush, this Teretz Kayanim. Because really it's Teretz Kayanim, right? So Rish Lakish wasn't one that was Mechadash the Drasha. So you're talking Rabbi Elazar heard the Drasha from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan as well. And that we know already from Yavam, Sadik Vavam, and Beis, Rabbi Elazar would say over Teretz Stam, not attributed to Rabbi Yochanan because Hakol Yoidin, that he didn't have to. When you put all these Gemaras together, this is like one footnote of Rabbi Margolis. But as we like to say, this is classic Rabbi Margolis. One other Gemara that has to be mentioned, and that is that I saw everybody asks that actually Esrim Vidalid Yadav, that Rish Lakish, right, he wanted to show Rabbi Elazar that he doesn't really know this word. So he asked him 24 kashas on Yadav. If you go through the Torah, there's no 24 Yadavs. There's not 24 Yadavs. You don't have 24 to ask, not in the whole Tanakh. So we're the 24 Yadavs that he even asked them. But I think the very, very posh that Sushtel is as a Gemara Mesechtes, Bava Mitzia, Daf Pei Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara talks about after Rish Lakish passed away. Rabbi Yochanan Basrei Tuva. Rabbi Yochanan had a tremendous amount of tsar over the untimely passing of the great Rish Lakish. Amar Rabbanan, so Rabbanan said, Man leisel liyasfel adaite. Who's going to go be Matthias? You hear the symmetry between these two Gemaras? Who's going to go be Matthias? Be Menachem Rabbi Yochanan. They're not be Menachem Rabbi Yochanan because someone said over a halacha and didn't give him credit for it. That be Menachem, this is real Nichem Avelim. He lost his Chavrus, he lost his Talmud, right? He lost the great Rish Lakish. So the Gemara said, Nezel Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas. They decided Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, also known as Rabbi Elazar of Ardaf, he's the one that should go, the Mechadid in Shmaitze, because he'll talk and learning to Rabbi Yochanan. We think he'll have the ability to be Mephaisim. So the Gemara says, also Yosef Kamei, he went in front of Rabbi Yochanan, and Kol Milsa Dahava Am Rabbi Yochanan, everything that Rabbi Yochanan would say, so Rabbi Elazar would say, Tanya the Messiah, I have a brisa that supports you here, I have a brisa that supports you there, Amar. So Rabbi Yochanan turned to Rabbi Elazar, he said, Abka Bar Lakisha, he says, you're like Bar Lakisha. He says, Bar Lakisha, I'm going to tell you how I used to learn with Rish Lakish. Ki have Amina Milsa, when I would say a vart, have a makshili esrim va'arba kushiyasa. He would ask me 24 kashas. Umafriknale esrim va'arba peruki. And I would come up and I would have to say 24 terutzin. Umemele rav chashmaitzin. Like this, we walked away, we knew the sugya. Va'at amritanya de misayelach. You're telling me a brisa, and here's the punchline. Otu lo yodana de shapekamina. I need you to tell me I'm saying good. I knew I was saying good. If I didn't think I was saying good, I wouldn't have said it. No. The Gemara continues, and the Gemara says that Mamish have a ka'azal v'kara money. Rabbi Yochanan went weiter, he was tearing his clothing, v'kabachi v'amar, and he was crying. He said, Heicha ad bar Lakisha, Heicha ad bar Lakisha, Mamish. And the Gemara tells the whole story of the end of the life of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan ends up passing away through this. A fascinating Gemara. But the bottom line is, what was the minig of Rish Lakish? When Rish Lakish heard Rabbi Yochanan say something, he would ask him Esrim va'arba kushis. He would ask him 24 kashas. I don't know if he had real 24 kashas over here to ask. Rishonim say we don't have 24 kashas, but at the same time, this is the signon of Rish Lakish. When Lakish fires away, he would come, he would ask him 24 kashas. When he would ask the 24 kashas to Rabbi Yochanan knew what to say. He came to Rabbi Elazar and he asked him 24 kashas. He was ishtik, he was stumping him a little bit. I think that's the symmetry of this Gemara. Sai with the Gemara in Yavam is Sadik Vavam is based, and Sai with the Gemara, of. Say with the Gemara in Mesechtes Bava Metzia Daf Pei Daled Amud Aleph. But this is just Furshpas. Just to mention one other ha'ara. And that is, so one of the many halachas that we had in the Mishnah was that an Isha is excluded from Smicha. Now, in our sugya, the Gemara said, what's the makar that an isha is excluded from smicha? Because it says yada, 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 and one of the yadas is coming to be mimayet v'lo yad ishtai. The truth is that Tosfos asks Kasha, that what's the havamina that an isha should be able to do smicha? Smicha had to be done before shchita. Shchita had to be done during the day. Takef was smicha shmita. In fact, the smicha had to be done literally right around the same time that the shchita was done. If smicha had to be done during the day, what emerges is that smicha is a mitzvah seish hazman garama, and we know nashim apata from all mitzvah seish hazman garama. Why do I need a pasuk to tell me that an isha is excluded from smicha? Typically, it's a mitzvah seish hazman garama, and nashim apata from all mitzvah seish hazman garama. Truth is, Tosfos in Masechtas Kedushin, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, asks this kasha as well. And over there, Tosfos asks an expanded version of the kasha. The Mishnah over there discusses a whole bunch of halachas that an isha is excluded from in the world of kachim. Hasmichos, v'hatnufos, v'hagoshois, v'hakmitzos, v'haktoros, v'hamelikois, v'hakabolos, v'hazois, noyhagim ba'anoshim, v'loy b'noshim. All these things are noyag ba'anoshim, v'loy b'noshim. And the Gemara brings psukim for every single one of these halachas. Freik Tosfos kasha, why do I need psukim in the Gemara to be made all these halachas? Typically, we know avodah had to be done during the day, and if avodah has to be done during the day, that means you could do it only by day, not by night. It's a mitzvah seish hazman garama, and we know nashim apata from all mitzvahs seish hazman garama. We once mentioned a teretz nifla to this kasha that the Malbim writes in his sefer Artzas Achayim. The Malbim says, how do we know that Noshim Apater from Mitzvah Saseh Shazman Garama? So it's a sugi in the first parak of Masechtas Kedushin, and it goes something like this. We know that Noshim are Pater from Tefillin. How do we know Noshim Apater from Talmud Tefillin? Because Tefillin is Iskish LeTalmud Torah, and we know Noshim Apater from Talmud Torah. So Noshim Apater from Talmud Torah, through a hekish I know Noshim Apater from Tefillin. Tefillin is Iskish L'Kol HaTorah Kula, because the pasuk says V'hoylo Isa Yatcha U'Lezikarim B'nei Nechel Mantia Teres Hashem B'ficha. So if Noshim Apater from Tefillin, that means Noshim are going to be Pater in Kol HaTorah Kula. They're Pater from all mitzvahs? No. Any mitzvah that's doimed to Tefillin. Tefillin is something that you do by day. It's not something you do by night. It's a mitzvah seish hazman garama. That's how I know Noshim Apater from all mitzvah seish hazman garama. So how do I know Noshim Apater from mitzvah seish hazman garama? If you take it from the top, Noshim Apater from Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah is iskish to Tefillin. That means Noshim are going to be pater from Tefillin. Tefillin is iskish l'kol ha'torah kula, which means that Noshim are going to be pater from any mitzvah that's similar to Tefillin. Tefillin is only noyig by yom, it's a mitzvah seish hazman garama, so Noshim are going to be pater from all mitzvah seish hazman garama. So the Malbim Adav Charev. He says that we know that when it comes to kachim, dover alamed behekish is einoi chayzer umelamed behekish. This is one of the klalim that underpins the entirety of kachim. If that's the case, a mitzvah saseh hazman garama is a davar alamed behekish that's chayzer malamed behekish. It's learned from Tefillin. Tefillin is lamed behekish from Talmud Torah, and it's chayzer malamed behekish the kol ha'torah kula, where it's dumi the Tefillin. That works in kol ha'torah kula with the exception of one area, with the exception of kachim. Being that by kachim there's a rule of davar alamed behekish and chayzer malamed behekish. Well, if that's the case, there's no mitzvah seish hazman garama when it comes to kachim. Lefi says, Oktamal we can be miyashav Tosfos kasha in Menachos Tzad Gimel Amud Beis, which is also Tosfos kasha in Kedushin Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. Why is it that there's so many places that you find a miyut of nashim when it comes to different avodas? Typically, avodah had to be done during the day, and if that's the case, the mitzvah seish hazman garama. Zoktamal the teretz is because mitzvah seish hazman garama doesn't apply to kachim. What does that mean? I thought it's a regular rule. The teretz is because the whole car of mitzvah seish hazman garama is a davar lamed behekish, which is chayzer malamed behekish. That rule works in kol ha'torah kula. It's not something that works when it comes to kachim. I found in the Shailos Hatshuvas Avnei Tzion. This is in Chelik Aleph. It's Simen Nun. It's Ois Zayin from the great Sinai and Oiker Harim, the Saint Peter Ruv's Chis Yugan Alayne. He said a davar chadash in his own words, but it's also a davar nifla mamish. He said, lefi this methodology of the Malbim, which, by the way, he brings also from the Mayan HaChachma. Mayan HaChachma is a sefer that was written on Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Mechaber, the Mayan HaChachma, was very known to the Chassam Sofer. In fact, in the Hespedim, in Drashas Chassam Sofer, there's a nifladige hesped that the Chassam Sofer gave on the Baal Mayan HaChachma. But either way, the Saint Peter who said that lefi this charifus of the Malbim, which is also in the sefer of the Mayan HaChachma, could be miyashiv, a Veltz Kasha that Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzen, the Baal Shoylo Meshiv, brings in his Shailas Tshuva Shoylo Meshiv Madura Kama Chelik Sheni Simen Kuf Chavav. He says, V'hinei Sha'alni Echad Mea Malamdin Lahoyel. He says, one of the Malamdin Lahoyel, right? That's an expression. He said, but one of the big Lamdim asked me the following question, and this question needs a tiny bit of an introduction. One Rambam. The Rambam in the beginning of Hilchas Tmura. This is Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. Kol HaMeimer Loika. If a person violates Tmura, was one of the topics of today's daf, gets Malkus. Not just that, for every single behemoth that he does Tmura, he gets a separate Malkus. Shenema lo yachlifenu v'lo yomerois. Says the Rambam, even though when someone does Tmura, he violates Tmura, all he did was talk, say something he wasn't supposed to take, but he didn't do a Maisa, and the rule is that Lav Shem Bei Maisa in Loikin Olaf, but Lamdu says the Rambam Shakol mitzvahs loisa say she'em ba ma'isa ein loikin of chutz mi nishba umeimar umekalol es chavero b'shem. And being that this is one of the three exceptions to the rule, you get Malkus if somebody violates the lav of Tmura. But the Rambam says, I have another kasha on the Malkus of Tmura. The Gemara's kasha says Lav Shem Ma'isa, and the Gemara says, this is the Mipi Shmua, that this is one of the three exceptions to the rule. The lav of Tmura is also a lav shenitik laseh. Sharei Nema, the pasuk says, Lo yachlifenu v'lo yomeroisai v'em hamer yomer v'yahu Tmurasa yeh kodesh. That in the event that you violate the Tmura, the kedusha is going to be chal. And in the world of the Rambam, that makes it a lav anitik laseh v'in kana makom laharich. But fake the Rambam, l'chayre Tmura is also a lav anitik laseh. And if it's a lav anitik laseh, then based on that, there should be no malchus. Says the Rambam, I'm going to tell you that's not a kasha. You know why? Mipnei it's because although this lav is nitik laseh, but the lav and the aseh are not shava. What does that mean? A tzibur, or even a carbon that's owned just by two people, Reuven and Shimon, they don't have the ability to make Tmura. But at the same time, if they went ahead and did the Maisa Tmura, they would be over the lav. As it relates to Tmura, says the Rambam, the Aseh and the Lois Aseh are not Shava. The Lois Aseh is more inclusive than the Aseh. The Lois Aseh is Negeya everybody, l'rabbi, tzibur, and shutfim. But the v'imhamer yomer v'yahu tmurasa yeh kodesh, that's not negay the tzibur and the shutfim. And says the Rambam Ashtikal Torah, the only time there's a rule of lav shenitik laseh and loikin olav is if the lav and daseh are shav. But if the lav and daseh are not shava, the lav is more inclusive than daseh, then you never say lav shenitik laseh. Even when you're over the lav in a way where you would have the essay, it doesn't matter. It's a taich in lav shenitik laseh. It's a taich in the lav and the essay. If the lav and the aseh are shava, you have the rule of lav shenitik laseh. If the lav and the aseh are not shava, you're not going to have the rule of lav shenitik laseh. This is a very rare shtickle Torah from the Rambam. Usually the Rambam lays out the law of the land without giving much explanation. Ki yodua. See the introduction to the Sefer Yam Shel Shlomo v'Oid Mar Mekaymes. But over here, the Rambam actually gives us a little bit of insight into how he went about his psak. The Rambam paskin that you get malchus for the lav of Tmura, and the Rambam said there's really two kashas on the malchus. One, the Gemara asks, isn't it a lav shein by Maisa mipi ashmu? For that we have a Messiah. Kabbalah even a Kabbalah. But there's another kasha, said the Rambam. It's a lav shenitik laseh, and to be miyashiv this, the Rambam said a shtickle Torah for the ages. The only time you say lav shenitik laseh is if the lav and the aseh are shava. But if the lav is more inclusive, it includes more people than the aseh, b'chai gav, then you're not going to say lav shenitik laseh. So Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzen, the great Goyen, said that one of the malamdin lahayel asked him the following kasha. He said, we know Rabbi Yehuda has a shita in Shas that a summa is potem in mitzvahs, stating that it's Yodua that the Rimitrani in his Sefer Machriya, Kfeger brings this by Riches, Mechas Chinuch talks about this throughout his Sefer, said that even Rabbi Yehuda that holds that Summa is potem in mitzvahs, it means he's potem from mitzvahs aseh. But Avada, he's going to be included in mitzvahs lois aseh. If that's the case, ask this Lamdan to the Shoyla Meshiv, it comes out that in the world of Rabbi Yehuda, every single lois aseh is more inclusive than an aseh. Because the lavin include the summa, and the essen don't include the summa. And if that's the case, how could there be a lav shenitik laseh? This was the kasha. This was the kasha that this lamdan asked the Shoyla Meshiv. And the lamdan went weiter. He says, don't tell me Rabbi Yehuda is a tanu polig. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of lav shenitik laseh. Who said Rabbi Yehuda has to hold of lav shenitik laseh? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that summa's patim and mitzvahs, and it's only for essen, not for lavin, as if it's state in the Sefer HaMachriya. Maybe it's going to come out there's no lav shenitik laseh. But the lamdan told him it can't be. You know why? Because there's a Gemara that's mentioned in many places in Shas. We all know this Gemara. I'm just going to quote it from Shvuas Daf Gimel. It says regarding the Karban Pesach, Lo yisiru mimenu ad boiker, va'noiser mimenu ad boiker be'ish tisroifu. Ba'akosov liten aseh achal lo yisaseh loy meshein loikin olav divi Rabbi Yehuda. There's no malchus on the lav of noiser. You know why? Because it's nitik laseh. Because if somebody violates this and noiser be'ish tisroifu. Rabbi Yaakov oimer loymen Hashem uzel mishum dav lav shem be'maisa lav shem be'maisa ein loikin olav. But the bottom line is that we know Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is that there is a lav shenitik laseh. L'chura, if there's a lav shenitik laseh, and the Rambam's right in this cloud that Ishtal Davek in Perak Alf Alocha Alf and Ilchas Tmura, that the only time you say lav shenitik laseh is if the lav and daseh ashava in Rabbi Yehuda's world that sumas potter for mitzvah saseh, but he's chayv for mitzvah lois saseh, it's not shava. And if that's the case, how could there ever be such a thing as a lav shenitik laseh? So listen to a davar charif and Azak Goy in the same Peteruf. He said that ruay de mistafina. I want to say something I never found anywhere in a sefer, which means it doesn't exist. See, he said, I'm going to tell you a davar charif. And that is based on the raid of the Malbim and based on the raid of the Menachos. He says, take a look in the Gemara Masechtas Bava Kama Daf Pei Zayin. This is also a classic Gemara. The Gemara said, Amar Rav Shisha Bereid Ravidi. My time of the Rabbi Yehuda. What is the Makar of Rabbi Yehuda? The Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sumas patim and mitzvahs. He said, Amakra. The pasuk says, V'zois ha mitzvah hachukim v'amishpatim. We learn from here, Kol sheyeshnei b'mishpatim. Any person that's included in Dinei Mominus, like if his shor damages his chayev, if he's mevayish somebody, he has to pay to make boishes. Yeshnoi b'mitzvahs v'chukim. Someone that's included in the parasha of Mishpatim is included in the parasha of Chukim. Any person that's excluded from the parasha of Mishpatim, he's not included in mitzvahs. And Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that assume is potter from Dinei Mominus. He's potter from Mishpatim. If he's potter from Mishpatim, he's going to be potter from mitzvahs and Chukim as well. Said the same Pei Teruf. How does Rabbi Yehuda know that assume is potter from Mishpatim? It's the Gemara right before that. The Gemara says, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. How does Rabbi Yehuda know that assume is potter from Mishpatim? Amakra. The pasuk says, "V'shavtu ha'eda bein hamaka ubein goyel hadam ala mishpatim ha'ela." Kol sheyeshnei b'maka ubegoyel hadam. Anyone that's included in the parasha of Reitzech b'shoigig, yeshnei b'mishpatim is included in mishpatim and dinei mominus. But kol she'enei b'maka ubegoyel hadam. But any person that's not included in the parasha of Reitzech b'shoigig, such as a summa, because it says b'loy ra'os. Remember, it says b'loy ra'os prat l'summa, who anyways is b'loy ra'os. So enei b'mishpatim is not b'mishpatim either. In other words, the makar that assumes patim and mitzvahs is learned out from a hekesh, from something itself that's learned out from a hekesh. Suma patim and mitzvahs is a davar alamed behekesh that's chayzer umalamed behekesh. V'shavtu ha'eda bein hamakim and goyel adam ala mishpatim ha'ela makish. The parasha of Reitzech b'shoigig to Mishpatim, and there's another pasuk v'zayis ha-mitzvah chukim ha-mishpatim, we makish the parasha of Mishpatim to the parasha of mitzvahs v'chukim. And based on Dover Alamed behekesh, Chayzer Malamed behekesh, Rabbi Yehuda formulated his position that assumes is going to be patim and ha-mitzvahs. But lefi this chiddush that the Malbim, the Ma'anach Chachma gave us, that any halach in Shas, that's Dover Alamed behekesh, Chayzer Malamed behekesh, can apply to Kachim based on the rule of the Sugas of Ezal Mekayman, of well, it would come out that although Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is that sumas patim and mitzvahs, but not when it comes to kachim. When it comes to kachim over there, a summa can't be patim and mitzvahs. The reason it can't be patim and mitzvahs is because it's all learned out from dam alam behekesh, which is chayzim lam behekesh, which is not true for kachim. Just like the G'dolei Achronim say that there's no mitzvah saseish as mangarama by kachim, because mitzvah saseish as mangarama is learned out from davar lama hekesh, and it can't be chayzim lama behekesh by kachim. So too, Rabbi Yehuda's sheet of summa patim and mitzvahs. This is all me'inyan le'inyan by se'inyan. Rabbi Yehuda's sheet of summa patim and mitzvahs also can apply to kachim, because the davar lama behekesh that can't be chayzim lama behekesh. The fiza yesh shloim ma'adal la'olam sheetas Rabbi Yehuda's. You're right. Lav shenitak laseh is a big problem. You know why lav shenitak laseh is a big problem? Because the lav and daseh are not shava. Why are they not shava? Because the lav is negay even the summa, and I say the summa's potter. Rabbi Yehuda shita is summa's potter and mitzvahs. Oh, but the Sefer Machriya says it's only mitzvah say. It's not the mitzvah's loisa say. What was the kasha of the Melamed Lahayo that the Shoyla Mesha brings? His groisa kasha was, what do you mean? Rabbi Yehuda himself said lav shenit leklasei. Where did he say it? By the Issa Noiser. Zok the same Peter Ruv. Issa Noiser is kachim. By kachim, there's no shitas Rabbi Yehuda that summa's potter and mitzvahs. If that's the case, the summa is going to be chayiv and that's the loisa. Oh, by kachim, kachim shiny. Kachim is already going to be different. By kachim, it's going to be different. This is a davar chadash. It's a davar charif. V'ruyin hadvarim l'mishamra.